we know the affinity to nature, kind of adherence to the circadian rhythms.
Yeah.
I think has a lot to do with that very kind of primal connection.
You live by not necessarily by seasons, but by different phases, you know. But I think we are so much used to this convenience to get everything instantly when we want to have it, that there is no real gratification in it anymore. This I think is really beautiful on living in the countryside. The other direction, I also had to get away from the countryside to the city to appreciate the countryside more. So I had to get away from Austria to appreciate Austria. And I think it's always that you maybe think a little bit more of where you are not, that actually guides you.
Absence makes the heart grow fonder.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. How do you teach people to live in a city which offers instant gratification, but you don't succumb to them? How do you build that kind of inner balance or stability? I don't know,
Yeah, I think in China, for example, you see that our cities are getting smarter, right? More technology, more surveillance, more data, everything becomes much more intelligent. But it's not necessarily about if we know more, but it's also about if we feel more in the city. So how can we steer that further, right? And in China there's now going on that they try to bring, the government tries to bring the smartness of a city to the village or to the countryside. But this, I think we also have to ask so that people are not moving away and so forth. But I think we also need to ask different questions of how can we bring the benefits of the countryside back towards the city. And this is a whole different discussion because it's not about intelligence, it's about consciousness. And then you ask yourself, like, how can you bring a sense of community into a city? What does it mean to be a good neighbor? How important is fresh air and clean water, and so to bring all these benefits maybe also towards the city.
Some of your work literally talks about solving problems like hunger and poverty, because that's how the projects work. Do you have any sense of, you've been in India briefly, you've worked in India briefly, have you gotten a sense of some of the peculiarities here as opposed to your time in China?
In China, decisions are getting made very quickly because there's one client and he has the power to make decisions. I think that India is a democracy. There are many different layers a decision needs to go through until it comes to you.
I'm actually seeing two very distinct parts of how your work emerges, and it links back to what I call the knowingness of consciousness, which is nature, which is very deep within you, and the projects that I see that are building towards a natural environment, right, have almost a formlessness to them. They're subservient to something larger, right? And then I see some of the projects drifting off into a direction where it almost feels like it's a competition, where the architecture is looking a little bit more formal. It seems to be a lot more architecture in some cases than others. Have you ever had the time, now that you're back in the mountains, to kind of reflect upon that sense of divide, and what are your kind of internal checks and balances?
Yeah. Totally. I think that's a very good analysis. I also feel that about our work. Some projects, they just asked for it, not to be necessarily iconic, but to be rememberable in a way. So, for example, a museum or so, it needs something where you're drawn towards an entrance, and then it's anyway white or black boxes. But it has a kind of a feel where people, it should be remembered or you should be attracted to. But all of that combines is, I think, a love about geometry. So even if it's a kind of a more shape or more building where you're more drawn towards to. It also has a pretty simple geometry behind it, and also has some simple rules behind it. Similar than, for example, residential buildings or building system that operates based on certain rules that you just constrain yourself with. Yeah.
You're a very flexible, and I like to use the word organism because it's far more fluid, right? Is that how do you guys build up your collaborations? How do you, I mean, it's instructive for us to understand how you can literally span across so many disciplines.
Yeah, I really love how the music business is doing that, right? Like there are, for example, there is a band, they are core, you know, out of 4 or 5 people, but they collaborate on certain songs with other bands, and they feature other artists, and you know they don't necessarily, just because they have an idea for a song which has to have, you know, a female vocalist, they don't get them into their team, or they don't get the big orchestra into their team just because they have the ability to record something, but they collaborate with other people.
Does China work similarly in terms of the bias towards craft and human resource and less industrialization? Are they in a transition period? Have they moved over?
When it comes to architecture, I think they were in a transition period, but they seem to have found their what defines now Chinese architecture. Like I have the feeling when I was first in China 2008, it was like a playground. But through the Pritzker Prize for Wang Shu, I think a lot changed. Like there is a new self-confidence in the direction of where especially young architects in China are heading. You know, to find some very traditional cultural elements like vector architects,
DNA and vector and Aryan who,
are doing, and this is a very distinctive style of looking at the vernacular, but transporting that to what modern architecture looks like, but also packing it into a story of the past and the future, and I find it very beautiful. And to be proud of an identity, right? So it should rather come from inside now.
Sure.
Now, you know, learned a lot from the West, copied a lot in the beginning and learned from them and built up upon that, right? So now with the self-confidence of that, there's a lot of possibilities for Chinese architecture to find their grounding in. I'm sure the same will be true then to India as well.
We're keeping our fingers crossed, hopefully.